Oh, we'd like to welcome all the viewers who, since our last show, may have written in and gotten their VIP viewers card. Because if you did, then starting with this show, you will be seeing and hearing the Insider's Edition. Now the news. After his car broke down and the farmer invited him to spend the night with them, the mystic accepted the offer and said that in return, if they desired, he'd speak to them on matters in which they might have an interest. But said that there were two things he would not talk about, and asked if they would care to guess what they were. And the farmer proffered politics and religion, and the mystic shook his head no. Then the farmer's daughter guessed sex and the weather, and he still indicated nay. Then the farmer's wife tried death and taxes, and the mystic again wagged his head no. All was silent for a few moments after that until the farmer spoke again. Well, we've covered all the common conversational taboos, so just what are the two things that you won't talk about? This and that, answered the mystic. This and that. How about another survey of one of the trickier parts? The obvious aspect of man that makes him unique and gives him his preeminent power is his ability to think. And in the realm of thought, everyone seems to be different. If not individually unique, at least different enough in their thinking to distinguish themselves in a meaningful way from those about them. And as long as this sensation is unanalytically accepted, it thus seems to be, and one never has the availability of realizing that life automatically furnishes each and every person with all the thoughts they've ever had or, under routine conditions, will ever need. Although it is as simple and clear as sugar water when seen, it is downright tricky to ever do so. Why? Well, for two reasons. One is that you're attempting to study something objectively, using at first only the something itself, which is alive, with its own self-interest at heart, and is thus by nature non-objective. And second, you're attempting to achieve something that is demonstratively unnecessary for a normally led life. And once again, you might ponder the fact of activity and ideas such as this being historically referred to as secret, when, more in actuality, it is simply of no interest or significance to ordinary men. All told, the trickiest of tricks are those never realized by the witnesses. One man generally slept late. It's either that he notes or else sleep early. The confinement of dualities can get the best of some people. In an invented world, must be the belief that things in that world can be changed, or else such a world will collapse. Civilization and the unrecognized exercise of tacit collusion. Step over here, my dear. I won't hurt you. My faithful assistant, in case I do another trick, slower than I did after I read the second page, which I noticed was so fast after I did it that no one in the audience seemed to even realize it had been dead. A happy magician may indeed be a quick magician may be a happy one, but a slower one perhaps is all that ever finds commercial success. If it wasn't for the fact that it was possible, I would tell you in the control room to stop the tape and we'd start all over. Through hook and crook, and mostly crook, one feverish man finally got Life the physician to come see him on house call. And after a quick glance at the fellow, Life pronounced its finding. A serious man is a sick man, and later sent him a totally outrageous bill, citing as cause the redundancy at which it had been required to make this diagnosis. Many people, in fact, quite a number of people, not only fail to recognize that life has a sense of humor, but even one that should they recognize its presence, they wouldn't understand. But see, right there is the point. What's the fun of laughing at something if you know what you're laughing at? And that last comment was not from me, but something that Life scribbled at the bottom of the bill it sent. And she didn't help with that. There are no wires or anything here. The operations of the ordinary mind are not unlike the situation of a head librarian who is so busily involved with the constant acquisition of new books that he never has the time to read any himself. Would you like for me to read slower? Simplicity is not only life's supreme camouflage, but also the key to penetrating same. Those now concerned over mental health unknowingly toil in the same school playground as the religious. Both groups under the impression that balloons they deem misshapen can be cured, if not treated, by relieving them of their air. What is more foolish than change in a man's pocket, lecturing him on the cost of pants making? From one view, the advantage in ordinary men being unable to effectively minister unto themselves is at least they cannot make themselves any worse thereby. Which, must I note, would be spelled inevitable. And what every alert student gets from his sophomore year in showbiz school is that if your act is bombing and the ploy for sympathy is not working, get passionate. Nothing helps sell or propel the unreal like a good injection of passion. One man's pronouncement. There are two major approaches to living available. One is where you live primarily directed by physical, unthinking instinct, and the other where you live predominantly led by the mind's analytic activity. But no matter which one you believe is preeminent in your life, it all works out the same. End quote. One man's observation of the day. Everybody swallowed another person. Well, I don't know that swallowed's the right word, but they got in there somehow. A guy's thoughts tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey." And when he ignored them, they did again, said, "Hey, it's me, thoughts." And he said, "Yeah, I know who you are." And that was that. A father so noted to a son, "You may know by the fact that someone will debate a subject, such as the nature of evil, that they could not comprehend it were it clearly explained to them." An off-the-roader's guide to criticism and hostility in the city. Who but fools and children get angry at goblins? One man tells us, "Yes, I had a nervous breakdown. I had to, before it had me." If it's not the restrictions of dualities that get some people, it's the appearance of streets being two-wayed in a three-wayed world. Concerning one reasonable wager. If ordinary people realized how much they reveal about themselves when they talk, it's a pretty safe bet that they wouldn't talk as much as they do. More profitable than trying to think about something in absolute terms of it being either real or illusionary is to consider how relatively close or far from reality it is, based on how near to immediate survival needs it is. This can be of great facilitation in the mental dismantling and fresh study of all aspects of civilization and man's institutions. It can. I'm sorry, I thought that was an editorial comment, for which I do not get paid. Yeah, I know it's worth every cent. As his understanding of what rulership was increased, a certain king looked down from the castle onto the people in the village below and thought, if wolves could blush, the electoral turnout would be even less than it is now. Perhaps silent, but still an editorial comment, I know. One legend says that as reward for a favor one early man did for God, he was given his choice of either being made to work on a feudal tower to the heavens, be subject to a worldwide flood, or have to think for himself. And after waiting for an answer for a much longer time than he had planned, God tried to expedite the matter by throwing in a fourth possibility and said that the man could also choose to have to do the eternal tango alone. Well, same as everyone else, but that he'd be made aware of it. There's an obscure myth that tells of one of man's last face-to-face conversations with God, some years after he had become well experienced in the big guy's ways, and said to the great one these 5 words: "Don't do me any favors." Ooh. One mother called aside a daughter with this message: I do wish that you would stop saying that people are full of shit. Why not instead say that people are full of life? After all, it is the same thing, but it sounds better. The limitations inherent in a 2-parent family can result in some expected, some unexpected, if not totally expected, conversational outcomes. In his continuing efforts toward literary fame, one man, by conscious predetermination, would cease all writings when he ran out of paper. He says that someday he hopes to become a mystic and be able to repeat this small triumph as regards his mind and thoughts. When problems arise within human systems presently needed by life, blame will be laid to the system rather than the men involved. Once you see this and understand its necessity in the routine realm, you lose any footing on which to stand and find fault with what appears to be the overall foolishness and misdirected attention so prevalent therein. You do. A man so mused, how come people would dismiss something unfamiliar to them on the basis that it can't be of any significance if they've never heard of it, but never reverse it and consider how many things have never heard of them and what that says about them? To attend to something in the more conscious sense is to deal with it adequately. Something much superior to cures in the ordinary mental sense, which never reaches even the satisfaction level of adequate. The ruminations of one man resulted thusly. If all talk is at its base metaphorical, then would not, in one sense, the mooing of cows and the bleating of sheep be vocal displays more directly representative of their speakers? And upon realizing the propriety of his observation, immediately also recognize the sounds of humans for what they really are. And life told him he could keep it as long as he didn't tell anyone else that he had it and would feed it. A man once so cautioned his son, don't let your thoughts get so entangled in ideas of conspiracies and there being specific hidden agendas behind certain human activities. Get it straight in your mind now that there is always something more to everything in the world of man. One man's version of the big question is the fact that we get through each day being as minimally conscious as we generally are, a negative comment on consciousness, or an absolutely complimentary one on the body. Now tonight's news regarding proverbs, axioms, and cliches. The reason there are so many different maxims concerning what makes the world go round is because men don't know what does. The existence of conventional wisdom is to help cover up the fact that men have none. A man once asked a mystic, do people like you know things that people like me would like to know if we knew what it is that you know? And even a mystic wouldn't touch that one. Well, other than enjoying a silent, good chuckle. Tonight's athletic program. As long as you take life personally, it has you inescapably by the mental short hairs. And no good to pull, it only makes it worse. One man never knew what was around each new corner he continually turned. He, in fact, constantly never expected the corners, in spite of past experience. To still, quiet consciousness, one man said, it's hard to believe that I found time in my busy schedule to meet with you. Found time to meet with you, hell, remembered to is more like it. Okay, let's get it out of the way. Compassion in a nutshell. As long as someone's letting life speak for them, even if their own lips are moving, there's no basis whatsoever for you picking on them personally. It proves to be a challenge for pedestrians attempting to fly not to cringe at the out-of-control radios blaring from passing cars. A challenge that must be eventually met if one is to get airborne. And a man asked a mystic, I have assumed that since so many have spoken about the need for tolerance and compassion, that there must be some pressing reality behind the words for those with a special interest. And my question is, how can a man directly attain such abilities? And the mystic replied, the problem is subtle indeed. For a man awake to the reality of life is, as it is commonly called, tolerant and compassionate. But moreover, he must be tolerant and compassionate to ever awaken to the truth about life. So what you're faced with is a nonlinear situation, wherein for a man to get to Istanbul, he must first somehow get there so as to know the way there. Before the man left, the mystic offered a final comment. As mind-torting as it seems to be, there is one plain thing that can be said and done in this matter, which is for a man with that hunger to refuse to accept the thoughts in his mind which appear to speak for his feelings as being anything other than the noise of passing traffic, and certainly not as anything personal, meaningful, or valid. All in all, a man's secret inner resistance against all that is mentally natural. Another choice-cut example of the great, yet we remain blind to it, variance between man's mental and physical worlds is in instances where some voices denounce a political leader as being sly, devious, deceitful, and without scruples, and which then express their inability to comprehend why the people still support him, which is a statement of mental reality. when the physical reality is that such traits are exactly what is needed and wanted in a leader. To believe that most talk is anything other than the talker wanting attention is to grossly miss the truth about most talk. A father once called all of his sons together and asked, "Do any of you believe that you are better than the average person?" And each who raised a hand, he shot. Then he asked, "Do any of you think that you are inferior to most people?" And those who indicated in the affirmative, he shot. Then he asked, "Now who among you feels that you yourself are probably just about average and of no special significance?" And all who identified themselves with this grouping, he also shot. Which left but one son standing, who asked the elder what the point of the inquiry had been. And the father sadly shook his head at the question, and, as he raised the gun to fire again, said, "I did hope that at least one of you would understand and thus survive. But much is uncertain, unpredictable, and disorderly in the endless expansion of the mental family of man." A man wrote a mystic and said, "I believe I would understand better your metaphors if you would present them in literal terms. Then again, I could be mistaken in this belief, in that I have already had 50 good years of opportunity to hear what life has had to say to me directly and see what that has amounted to. Yours, etc." There is a way to not fight the current while still not being swept downstream. An awareness of one's mental activity without a struggle with it. Everyone is ill, flawed, and lame, but only the ordinary take notice. One story says that man is born with two clocks in him, and that one of them he senses and it runs in one direction, and that the other he's unaware of and it runs in the opposite direction, and that it is this situation that is the basis of all of man's conflicting ideas of whether he is making progress or going backwards, and that the enlightened are simply those with a consciousness of the two clocks and thus know the true present position of life at all times. The bus stopped at the corner where a mystic stood and said, "Want to ride?" And the alert one eyed the conveyance suspiciously and replied, "Did life put you up to this?" One myth says that a man should never go anywhere life wants him to go, or else he'll end up just being a man in quotation marks. The corner of a mystic pulled up to a bus and declared, "No one rides me but me," and then just barely so, at which life had a good, hearty chuckle, always delighted at its own sense of humor toward itself. Looking deeply into the full-length mirror of collective man, one chap so mused, "Being a childish, pathetic fool is not so shameful if you're aware of it. Totally, unconditionally, and impersonally aware of it." And one father pulled the following pop quiz on a son. What is the most egregious, if not excellent, example of a meaningless question that plagues the mind of man? And the lad replied, "I guess it's still probably the one about which has a great influence on man, heredity or environment." Oh, I've just been handed this late-breaking story regarding talk. It now appears relatively certain, what some have long suspected, that it is almost impossible to say anything without at least in part misrepresenting that which you're talking about. Guess it's good this came in near the end of the show. Another way to gauge if you are more conscious than you used to be is whether the only type of stress you now recognize is death. In the ocean's gulfs, seas, and fjords, dye placed in one area will eventually color the waters in others. Or, that which appears local was originally universal, and to opened eyes it does return. Tonight's fairy tale. One man wrote down everything that bugged him in a notebook, and when it was full, named it Bug. Then proceeded to become a frog and ate it. The end. Tonight's transportation news. Illusionary trains can only survive by each person adding a car thereto. And now tonight's channel surfers update. No matter where you turn, you can't get away from it. And now tonight's physiological update. Ears don't lie. A bit of news might I recommend to the attention of that just mentioned letter writer. And now tonight's musical mental health news. The ordinary thoughts of men are not unlike the advertising claims for CDs. Virtually indestructible and should last a lifetime. News to which a few utter a grievous moan. The sign at one railroad museum's zoo said, "Do not attempt to feed the animals, or in the alternative, try and eat their minds. Remember, you have been warned." Adam's good twin, who didn't piss off God, was the first to be made privy to the possibility of a man affecting the state of his own awareness and establishing a platform of individual consciousness, apart from that of collective humanity. And that in this initial introduction of the idea, the big guy pointed out two specific ways by which it might be approached, which, though lost by history, the sibling labeled the way of trying something and the way of trying nothing. But few have subsequently shown much interest therein, since they both require effort. As they sat on the front porch, a father responded to a son's question thusly: "Yes, it can be profitable not to play in traffic, but this effort only achieves serviceable realization when you can also stop thinking about the traffic." One man told life, "Bite my ass," and life just laughed. Too late. I said that to you years ago. At the basic, simple stage in life, men take things literally. Then at the more civilized thinking stage, men take things metaphorically. And the few who finally reach the stage of enlightenment don't take anything off anybody, including you know who. Yeah, that's right. Themselves. Hey, yeah, right on. Wrap it up to go. A man asked a mystic, "How long can you keep talking?" And the mystic replied, "How long can you keep the motor running?" And finally, this piece of news. One man's response to any question was, "No, not really." And if that wasn't accepted, he'd change it to, "Yes, not really." As some of you know, I am, we all love the word, privy to, you might say, inside information, not generally available to the public, or if so, I have access to it prior to its common knowledge. And it's really not particularly pertinent to anything, but what was on my little mind, there is a new discovery that has been made. It is now a proven fact that the ears do not lead or feed directly into the brain. Oh, and one more thing before we start that is also not related to anything in particular, but that person that I've mentioned to you before that has spent a lifetime involved with what most people would call the mystical path, quest. He recently mentioned to me, it was news to me, but that at some time long ago he had undertaken sort of a public side that he tried to get out public and speak to people about that which he was involved with, and said that he shortly discovered that his audience, those that seemed interested, seemed to be made up almost entirely of smartasses. He said that seemed to be the only people, by and large, that seemed to be attracted to what he was talking about, was just absolute, I mean, he just called them that, smartasses. And he said he then realized that on that basis he only had, or based upon that fact, there was only three possibilities after that. One was to change his manner of presentation, to change dramatically what he was talking about, or the way in which he was speaking of it, so as to change his audience. Or two, just learn to live with having an audience of nothing but smartasses. Or three, give it up. I thought tonight, consider government as an example of man, of the collective mind of man. And I may drag it into another night or so I might set up things that I do not get around to mentioning specifically tonight, which I know will be a great shock and disappointment to many. But one had to do with a news item, or the news item had to do with this, that I know had the potential to sound obscure, that said that in the oceans, gulfs, seas, and fjords, dye placed in one area would eventually color the waters in other areas. There is a collective mind of man that I have mentioned before, and as always, it is, or can be described as being so subtle, and yet at the same time so small and subtle, and simultaneously so blunt, in your face, and inescapable, that the mind can almost make nothing of it. People have dealt with this throughout history. Philosophers here and there, just writers have stumbled across little bits and pieces, and it never goes anywhere because they're taking something that is universal, and as the mind must, make it a local. That is, they'll point out an example and say, isn't this strange? In the same way the last time I was using the idea that men normally, or is not unknown to normal minds, the idea of the placebo effect. And they see a phenomenon, and they can pick out examples. Yes, this happened to my brother, or I was in a test back in college, and so I know exactly what this placebo effect is. But there's the example, and then they try from that, as they would say, to extrapolate some universal theory. Forget fact. They settle for a theory. And they can't even come up with a theory, because there are certain things, or they're all that way, but some of them get so close to the center of things. We'll leave it at that. They get so close that some things, that not even theories are workable. That they take that which is all-encompassing, and the mind selects an example, and they cannot come up with a serviceable theory or fact from that, because what they're attempting to do without knowing it is to take the local back to the universal level. And the mind cannot do that. The mind is a severely structured one-way street. And you cannot back up it. You can, but all you've got is the opposite of the way you went down. That is known, I think, in most circles as the basis of intellectual debate, scientific discussion, the battlefield upon which conflicting, contrasting ideas play themselves out to a satisfactory conclusion, don't you wish? Which again is why sports are so popular, because by God they do reach at the end of each game a damn conclusion. There is a finish to it. But the mind, if it goes down the street one way and it does not like it, the greatest flash of inspiration available to an ordinary mind is to get there at the end and go, and suddenly, in this striking display of wondrous insight, decide, I'll go in the opposite direction, by God. Do I have to point out the conclusion of that? You're at the end of the one-way street at the other end then. Normal segue. Back to where we were. You can see government, I was going to pull out some examples, of the collective mind of man at work, and it being so subtle and simultaneously so all-embracing as to men can never actually learn anything from this. That is, the mind cannot, because all it can do is therefrom extract examples, and the examples always are based upon some sort of conflict, so it always ends up as a criticism. It always ends up as some observer pointing down the street and saying we should not go that way. And here comes a load of traffic back at him, so he steps aside and then go, well, perhaps we should go this way or consider that way. But it is all a mental street cop of trying to direct traffic one way, and if you don't like that, the only thing that you have available is traffic goes back the other way. Would you get to the point? Okay, all right. You're not much of an assistant anyway. I've got 2 or 3 examples in mind, and I'm going to start with the worst one. That is this, and this is, well, you people know it, but who have been listening for a while, but for anyone new to watching this, it's not in any manner a reflection on your intelligence. Intelligence has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the workings of the mind and the things of which it is capable and the things of which it is incapable under ordinary conditions. So here it comes. It is a common example. It is so common you're not going to find anything uncommon about it when I start it. And then you got to listen fast or else I got to waste forever. You can read 20 minutes or 20 years trying to point. Look, it's right there, and it's no secret. It's just right there, and it's like trying to describe to bright colors a sunset. Here is something that you commonly hear. I say here, the press, let's use the press. It is reported as news. A reporter, a commentator, just using, remember, politics amongst many other things. I could be selecting, as I oftentimes do, religion, the arts, but politics, the government, as an example of man's collective mind. A reporter says, someone of some repute, an accepted man of some political acumen, he says, the problem, let's say it's election time here in France, and this commentator says, the biggest problem facing the socialists this election time is how are they going to bridge the gender gap. That here we have a majority of the French electorate now is of the distaff, that women make up a larger percentage of the voting public than do the men, and the socialists have historically been seen as some good old boy closed club. And now they finally realize that we are now into the 22nd century, and it's time for them. They are going, the most pressing problem, what they must overcome is a closing of the gender gap. At any rate, here in France, you've heard that so often, it is almost a cliche. But now here's the sorts of things you do not notice, and reminding new listeners, this has nothing whatsoever to do with politics or socialists or men or women. Nothing. Nothing. This is true symbolism. This is not metaphor, because I'm not even talking about, I have no interest in, and nor am I referring to in any meaningful way, the reality of the examples I'm using. So it does not mean one thing and something else. It means something else. Well, unless maybe you got the hot flashes today, or you're kind of worn out, then take it as a metaphor. I don't care. See, that thing about it, if you take something as a symbolism instead of a metaphor or vice versa, it doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter to me. Okay. Just trying to let you off the hook. At any rate, it becomes part of the common accepted reality of the day. You hear that once, that the most pressing problem facing the socialists to stay in office or to win a majority of parliament is to bridge the gender gap. And let's say you keep up a little of the news, you're exposed to it and you hear it, it is part of reality. It is now repeated more and more, that every time the conversation, no matter what news source you turn to, people out on the street, within a matter of days, if not hours, within a matter of days, people at the local intellectual pub, bistro, are sitting around talking, blah, 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 blah. Now I'm referring to intelligent, sophisticated, worldly wise people. There they stand, or their cafes, kind of lychee, but I don't know why they would be ordering that in France, but it's a complex world nowadays. Sipping their wines, and you hear people going, blah, 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 blah. And then you hear, they're kind of maybe crowded around one distinguished looking guy, and the conversation lulls, and this one guy goes, well, I'm not going to try to do it in French, by the way, but he says, well, be all that as it may, it still remains the fact that if the socialists cannot overcome that gender gap, you can just write them off, and you can take my word for that. And he looks around. It's down to that level. Now listen to me. Where did this piece of information? Now I got to look for words, because there is no real description for this. That's why I have to make up things like metavesco. I hadn't made up a word for this, because at first it sounds so simple, and you think, yeah, go on. No, it's not go on. You got to stay where it starts, because you don't know. You don't go on. Don't let your mind do that. I'm asking you, where did this so-called gender gap problem arise? Let's say that one person put the phrase together. The word's already there, but let's say that last week, when the primaries first started, when it considered to be election time here in France, and some political commentators were sitting around having a discussion on TV, or in some print media were putting together an article, whatever, and they're talking, and it's back and forth, like that great playing field, the area of debate and intellectual, the throwing out of ideas, and them trying to, one person make a comment, somebody fill it in, somebody oppose it, and they're talking about the problems that the socialists are now experiencing after Mitterrand, after the last big socialist landslide. And they're talking about the problems and what's happened and why it slipped. And some people talk about, well, the promise of the economic promise of the socialists have not come to pass, some of the social reform, blah, 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 blah. And there's no rhyme or reason to this now. But one guy, it comes his turn, let's say it's a TV round table, and one of them says, well, all of that, I have no doubt, is playing some part in the socialist current electoral problems. But I would say, I mean, I'm sure all my distinguished colleagues here know you've kept up with a rising percentage of female voters here in France, now controlling the majority of the votes cast in the last election. And we all know, he turns around, we all know how the Socialist Party has, at least has given the public appearance of being perhaps the last strong bastion of male-dominated political activity. He goes, so here's what strikes me, without a doubt. It's like I'm not sure whether it's true. I'm not sure whether the current leadership in the French Socialist Party is that strongly identified with whatever masculine interests are. But it's the women, I would say it's the public's perception. It strikes me, but it strikes me that the public, and probably women in particular, at least have this, they have this perception like there's it's like a gender gap. It's like here's this party asking for votes, the Socialist Party, and the party knowing that they must appeal to women to get in office or to stay in office, and it's like that they have heretofore not shown any public interest, not marketed themselves as being interested in feminine causes, and so it's like a gender gap. Perhaps it gets quoted the next day. Again, I repeat, for any new people, this literally has nothing of any significance. None of this. But let us say the next day it gets picked up. I mean, it has, for whatever reason. It seems to have at least an oral intrigue. The gender gap. The gender gap. Nice sounds, a new little phrase, and life continually needs new little phrases. And it's not only that, but it fits into a current publicly attractive scenario, that is the upcoming election, the running of the candidates now. And we've got at least half the population involved with this, females. So gender gap is neat to begin with, but then the socialist problem, the socialist most pressing, what that guy say last night? They run a tape, somebody gets a transcript, that probably the most pressing problem that the socialists must overcome in this upcoming election is the gender gap. Without beating this absolutely into a mushy pulp, resembling something that you might get inadvertently at a health food store while seeking a hamburger, suffice it to say that in my made-up scenario, which is part and parcel of actually where we are, of course we know we're not in France, I was being funny, but here in Sweden, most of you are aware of the fact that the perceived or the so-called gender gap problem that socialists are facing here. Of course, in our case, it's the Christian Democrats, but I already told you it's of no consequence. Well, why did you change it from Christian? Never mind. See, you're not following. Well, why did you change it, though, if it's no consequence? Why did you change it from French socialists to Swedish Christian Democrats? I can't believe I try to talk about this at times. And he says, well, I can't believe I try to listen. That was known as I forget what that was known as. So, here we are some days later, and the socialist problem of bridging the gender gap, I repeat where I was a few minutes ago, there is no real serviceable, there is no more conscious verbal description of this. So I'm just going to use two or three I can pull out that would be commonly acceptable. The socialist problem of bridging the gender gap has now become a piece of contemporary reality. No one questions it. It has been, and there's no way, I'm not saying that one thing proves it. I was going to say it has now become so common, it has been used so frequently in the last 60 hours, the last 2 weeks, the last fortnight for us here in Finland. It has been used, but it's not just the common usage, understand. It is not just that. But I've got to press on that you just got to be able to put yourself here in a scenario, in a scene that I'm describing that takes place continually, and it has no real beginning, has no end, has no north side, no south side, it has no up and down. There you are in France. And you're surrounded by this new little fact. Whether you have any great interest or not, you accept it as a fact that the socialists' most pressing problem in the upcoming election is their bridging of the gender gap. The gender gap has become a reality. That's what this represents. A reality. Either that or I'm bragging again. Well, I'm bragging on the gender gap. Either that or I'm being humble. And no, this is not a vote. We're not. This is not a quiz. I'm playing around because I'll try it again. See, the gender gap, when I say it has now become a reality, not only the gender gap, but the problem, it's more than just the gender gap already became now, once the phrase was made up, became to those who hear it. And of course, every cliche, every new term that pops up does not make it. Every show that hits Broadway verbally does not have legs. Some of them close up after they're first said. But for whatever reason, in this case, gender gap becomes part of the common vernacular for a while. But it's not just words. People unanalytically, the intelligentsia, the sharps, the political leaders of the area, it's not just some dumb cliche they picked up. Without any analyzation, it has become a reality. And I say it's become a reality. You won't see me really keep cutting around the edges till there are no edges. It didn't become a reality. And by that, I don't mean that it did not become a reality. It is a reality, but it didn't become a reality. That's what I'm trying to get at here in a minute. And of course, hoping the tape's going to run out because I can't get there with it verbally. It's a matter of whether you can. The gender gap, not only that, within a matter of moments, the guy who made up the term, according to my made-up scenario, who made up the term gender gap, he even expanded it. He added embellishments to it. He de-rococoed the original invention. That it's not just the gender gap, it is the socialist most pressing problem of bridging the gender gap. According to which size you want to try to choke on. But now the gender gap, and more specifically, the socialist most pressing problem being a bridging thereof, is now a part of reality, not just verbally. Now we can say that. And if I was going to try to whip up on it any more and had more time, I could start off and say, well, it's just verbal. But that's easy to say. It's beyond verbal. And there is no other way to describe it, but it's beyond verbal. It is now, I can do this, it's now a part of their, how about this, quote, reality. Which, you know, don't immediately grab that and put it in your pocket and go, oh, now I got it. You're just saying it's people's imagination. Well, yeah, but hell, people's mental life, civilization's imagination. So don't pass it off with that, because again, you're going to miss it. But here it is. The socialist problem of overcoming or bridging the gender gap is now a real thing. And I'm not trying to lay on thing. It is a reality. It is a real problem. Where did it start? Here we go, only 2 minutes. Now listen, you got to do this yourself. You can't depend on me because it cannot be done to the mind. I'm asking you rhetorically, where was there a person? Where was there a person that stood somewhere, the most astute political observer in the world, at least in France, what in the world? Where was a person that stood somewhere in some way, literally or figuratively, it stood somewhere and was observing the socialist. That was his bailiwick. That was the area in which he was most expert. He wrote, who and where did a man stand somewhere and look at the Socialist Party and everything involved with the French elections, everything involved with everything, and he saw that in some way their problem was bridging the gender gap. I'm going to have to go ahead and tell you. You know damn well no such thing happened if you can hear me at all. If you can't, you should probably, you've turned it off by now anyway. You can't figure what it's doing. There was never an instance where somebody, anybody, stood and observed, and it's not just the gender gap, but we're stuck with the example that I've raised, that somebody looked at something. Not just an instance, but maybe he had weeks of covering the socialist, or he had years. He's been covering this whole beat, and he's looking at it all. And that one day, it struck him that the biggest hindrance, what the Socialist Party this year, this time around, the biggest thing they have to overcome is a bridging of the gender gap. I'm just going to have to put it to you simply and truthfully. It never happened. There's no basis for it. There's no way it could happen. There's no such thing as a gender gap. There's no such thing as a bridging of the gender gap. So nobody could have ever stood there and said, I see what it is. And yet, the damn thing happened. And I mean, it happened to the point that it is now an integral part of contemporary French society. It is a pressing question. It is the topic of conversation amongst the intelligent, sophisticated people of France this very day. And it is treated, and this is not a comment on the stupidity of Frenchmen or humanity. It's not. It is as much now, it is as real as God. The socialist problem of bridging the gender gap, that's just as real as heaven, purgatory, hell, downtown Cleveland. No, it is. I shouldn't let you off. The socialist problem of bridging the gender gap is just as real, literally, it is just as real as God, Allah. It is just as real as life after death, as karma. It is just as real. That's what I want you to understand. I'm not making fun of it. And yet, there's nothing to it. And that's not even the point that I was trying to raise tonight. Not only is there nothing to it, that's not really the point, is that it went from being nothing into it now touching a large number of people. That it is now, the waters have been colored and tinted in areas far from where it started. That it spread, that there are now people repeating it. And not just because they're idiots. It is like, as people repeated it, that if you held them down and say, where did you even hear the term, this thing about the problem of the gender gap of the Socialist Party? They very likely, in all, as humans call it, truthfulness, would say, well, I never heard anybody say it exactly that way. And you think, how in the hell did it leak out over here? They do not understand that we're all Miss Piggy mentally. We're Kermit. They think that they are thinking.